Hi, I'm Kyrex, and lately I've been reminiscing about the days of coming home from school and getting on some BO2 zombies and playing for hours. And I figured I'd read some Reddit stories while I play. I know a lot of these Reddit story YouTube channels are just AI, but this is really me reading these stories. So whether you're studying, eating, getting ready for bed, or just looking for something to listen to, hopefully you enjoy as I read a few stories. The first story is from r/stories and the user is Sing for my Bling 21. I accidentally went on a date with someone who thought I was their other Tinder match. So a couple of months ago, I matched with this girl on Tinder. We had a pretty normal conversation, nothing crazy. But eventually she asked me to grab coffee. Chill, right? We meet at this cute local spot. She gives me a quick hug, and right off the bat she says, "Wow, you look even better than your hiking pics." Problem is, I don't hike. I don't even walk briskly. I just nod and laughed it off. We keep talking and she starts referencing stuff that makes zero sense. Like, your dog is so cute. What was his name again? Bentley? I don't have a dog. Never have. Then she mentions how I told her I used to live in Colorado. Again, not me. I've never even been west of Kansas. So now I'm trying to figure out if I have early onset memory loss or if she's mistaking me for someone else entirely. Finally, mid-latte I ask, "Hey, just to clarify, what's my name?" She looks confused. "Jake?" Guys, my name is not Jake. We just stared at each other for a solid 5 seconds before she burst out laughing. Apparently, she was messaging two guys at once and mixed us up. The worst part? She said, "Honestly, I thought you were Jake this whole time, but I was vibing too hard to stop." We ended up finishing the coffee, laughing about it, and weirdly enough, we're still dating. She now has me in her phone as not Jake. That story was pretty short, but it really caught my attention, so I wanted to read it. Honestly, I don't even know what I would have done in that situation. Let me know down in the comments what you would have done. Anyways, let's get into the next story. The next story is from r/stories, and the user is medicalstyle6605. I think someone has been living in my house without me knowing. I live alone in a small one-bedroom house. I work second shift, so I usually get home around midnight. The first weird thing I noticed was my kitchen chair being slightly pulled out one night when I came home. I thought maybe I'd just forgotten. Then it started happening more often. Little things. Cabinet doors open when I swear to close them. My cereal box moved to the other side of the counter. The hallway light on when I never turned it on. I convinced myself I was just tired from work. Until last week. I walked in and there was a half-empty glass of water on the counter. I don't drink water out of glasses. I always use a bottle. I actually stood there for like 10 seconds just staring at it. No broken locks, no signs of break-in. Then I started noticing it. My bedroom door being cracked open when I always leave it shut. The faint sound of footsteps at night. Like someone walking barefoot down the hall. Always around 3:30 a.m. Yesterday I installed a cheap motion sensor camera in the hallway. Last night I woke up to the alert on my phone. The video showed my hallway light flickering on, and a shadow moving from the kitchen toward my room. Not fast, just walking, calm. But here's the thing that's messing me up the most. The door never opened. The camera never caught anyone entering or leaving the house. But the glass of water on the counter was full again. I don't know if I should call the police or a therapist. That story was low-key predictable, but it's whatever. Me personally, I'm not a believer in ghosts, but if that had happened to me, I would be freaked out for sure. This next story is from r/stories and the user is Donovan221. I found my boyfriend's second phone. I wish he was cheating. Me and my boyfriend started dating around 6 months ago. It was the first relationship I've ever had. I had never been so happy. It was like we were meant to be. I met him at a coffee shop I frequent. I started noticing him there any time I went. Sometimes I'd catch him staring, and he'd look around all embarrassed whenever I did. After a while, I found myself silently hoping that he'd come over and ask to sit with me. We'd been playing eye tag for a couple of weeks, smirking and laughing at each other, but neither of us had taken the extra step of introducing ourselves. When he finally did, I felt butterflies start flapping around in my stomach like never before. His blue eyes, that curly black hair, and his cute little freckles. I'm not afraid to admit that I was smitten. Our relationship grew from there. We were seeing each other every weekend, watching movies, having dinner, playing some mini golf. I knew it was a honeymoon phase. I just didn't care. He made me feel wanted, and that was just not something I was entirely used to. He'd show up with my favorite flowers, favorite candles, always knew the right thing to say. I don't want to ramble. I just can't get over how perfect I thought he was. Things started to go a bit sideways one night at a sleepover at his house. I had gotten up to pee late at night. I could have swore I heard the vibration of a phone coming from his sock drawer. I was too tired at the time to really pay it any attention, but it was still fresh in my mind the next day. I asked him about it, and he got defensive enough for me to become suspicious. He showed me all of his drawers though. There was no phone in sight. That kind of subsided my suspicion a bit. A few weeks went by without issue. We never argued. He made me feel like the only girl in the world. Then we had another sleepover. Yet again, after he was fast asleep, the vibrations of a cell phone came echoing, this time from his closet. This time around, I was awake enough to actually investigate. But once I did, I immediately regretted it. Hidden within an old shoebox that was buried beneath a stack of blankets, I found it. A second cell phone. The screen was lit up with storage-full notifications. But what caught my attention was the wallpaper. It was me, asleep in bed. I wasn't even the wallpaper on his actual phone. Seeing myself like this only made my mind race more. I couldn't help myself. Luckily, he didn't have a password to unlock the phone, but what he did have a password for was his photos. I took a wild guess. That's why I think it was fate that I made this discovery. I put in my birthday, and the Photos app unlocked. My jaw dropped, and my heart sank. There were hundreds, if not thousands of pictures, and they were all of me. Some were of me at his house, on the toilet, in the shower, sleeping in his bed. Some were from places that didn't even make sense to me. Me at the coffee shop, reading a book, me walking home from school, standing in line at the grocery store, me outside my apartment fishing around in my purse for my keys. More than anything though, there were pictures of me asleep in my own apartment. Some were taken from my window, my second-story window. Others were taken of me from inside the apartment. I kept scrolling, and the more I did, the more terrified I became. The photos dated back to at least 2 years ago. Family dinners, early morning jogs, study sessions in the library. I was getting sick to my stomach. As I scrolled, a noise from behind me snapped me out of my trance. The sound of my boyfriend's bed creaking and squeaking from his shifting weight. He called my name. Once, twice, 3 times. I never responded. I heard his footsteps rush up behind me. They stopped a few inches from my back. Instead of asking what I was doing, apologize, or even attempting to grab his phone, he began laughing, cackling, like a madman. And as I stood there too paralyzed to turn around, he finally spoke again. "Happy anniversary, sweetheart." That story was pretty creepy and unsettling. Just imagine that happening to you. The 4th story is from r/horror stories and the user is Gamel Frank. I work as a morgue doctor. Our janitor can stop a family's grief in 2 minutes, but his price is horrifying. I'm a medical doctor, specifically a forensic pathologist. A few months ago, I landed my first official position at the large county morgue. After years of medical school, residency, and brutal hours, I finally had a stable job with a clear routine. The work is not glamorous, but it is necessary. I examine the deceased, determine the cause of death, and prepare the reports. It is quiet, methodical work, which is exactly what I wanted. The facility itself is located in the basement level of a massive hospital complex. It is a sterile, cold environment filled with stainless steel tables, bright fluorescent lights, and the constant heavy smell of chemical cleaners. There are only 3 of us who work down here during the day. The senior medical examiner, myself, and the janitor. The senior examiner is a quiet woman who spends most of her time in her office reviewing files. We barely speak unless it is about a specific case. That leaves the janitor. He is an old man. His skin is deeply wrinkled, resembling weathered leather, and his posture is severely hunched. He wears a standard gray maintenance uniform that always looks slightly too large for his thin frame. He moves slowly, dragging a mop bucket down the long tiled hallways, keeping entirely to himself. He never speaks to me or the senior examiner. He just does his job, cleaning the floors, wiping down the stainless steel tables after we finished our examinations, and emptying the biohazard bins. I thought he was just a quiet, isolated man working a miserable job, but within my first 3 weeks, I started to notice a pattern. The morgue has a small viewing room. It is a space where families are brought to identify the bodies of their loved ones, or to spend a few final moments with them before they are transported to a funeral home. It is, without a doubt, the heaviest room in the building. As a doctor, you learn to detach yourself from the emotional weight of death, but witnessing the raw grief of a mother or a husband in that viewing room never gets easier. People react to sudden death in terrible ways. They collapse on the floor, they scream until their vocal cords tear, they hyperventilate, they beg the doctors to tell them there has been a mistake. It is loud, chaotic, and deeply tragic. But I noticed something impossible happening whenever the old janitor was working near the viewing room. The first time I noticed it, we had received the body of a young man who died in a motorcycle accident. His parents were brought to the viewing room. Through the heavy wooden door, I could hear the mother sobbing hysterically. Her wails were echoing down the tiled hallway. It was the sound of a person breaking apart completely. I was standing near the reception desk, filling out paperwork, feeling that familiar knot of heavy pity in my stomach. The old janitor walked down the hallway, dragging his mop bucket. He stopped outside the viewing room door. He left his mop leaning against the wall and slowly pushed the door open. He stepped inside. I assumed he was just going in to empty the trash or clean a spill, completely oblivious to the grieving parents. I considered going in to pull him out and tell him to give the family some privacy. But less than 30 seconds after he entered the room, the screaming stopped. It did not taper off into quiet crying. It stopped entirely, as if a switch had been flipped. A minute later, the old janitor walked back out the room, picked up his mop, and continued down the hall. Shortly after, the parents walked out of the viewing room. I braced myself to see their ruined faces, prepared to offer them water or a chair. But they did not look ruined. The mother's face was dry. The father was holding her hand. They looked calm. They looked incredibly, deeply peaceful. It was a genuine, relaxed relief. They thanked the receptionist politely and walked out to the elevator. I stood there, completely confused. You do not recover from the sudden death of your child in 2 minutes. Over the next month, I watched this exact scenario play out dozens of times. A grieving family would arrive, broken and screaming. The janitor would slip into the room. A few moments later, he would leave, and the family would emerge in a state of profound and unnatural peace. I never heard what he said to them. I tried to stand near the door once, straining to listen, but all I could hear was whispering. It sounded like he was speaking a language I did not understand. The syllables thick and harsh, whatever he was doing. It was erasing their grief completely. I asked the senior examiner about it one afternoon. I asked her if she had ever noticed how the janitor interacts with the families. She did not look up from her paperwork. She simply told me that the old man had been working in the morgue long before she started. She told me he had a gift for comforting the bereaved, and that I should leave him to his business. Her tone was sharp and final, making it clear the conversation was over. But the pattern with the families was not the only strange thing about the janitor. There was also the rule about the night shift. There's a very strict, unwritten rule in our facility. No one is allowed to stay in the morgue past 6 in the evening. The official explanation is that the hospital cuts the ventilation and power to the non-essential basement sectors to save money. But that is a lie. The power stays on. The real rule is simply that the medical staff must vacate the premises before nightfall. Only the janitor stays. He is the only person authorized to be in the morgue overnight. I learned how strictly this rule was enforced during my 2nd month. We had a backlog of reports due to the large pile up on the highway. I decided to stay late at my desk to finish typing up the autopsy notes. I watched the senior examiner pack her bag at 5:30. She told me make sure I left before 6. I nodded and kept typing. At exactly 6 o'clock, the door to my office swung open. The old janitor was standing in the doorway. He was holding his mop. He looked at me, his deep, dark eyes locking onto mine. "It is time for you to go," he said. His voice was incredibly deep. I told him I just needed another hour to finish my reports, and that I would lock up when I was done. He did not argue. He simply stepped fully into my office, walked over to my desk, and reached down the wall outlet. He pulled the power cord to my computer directly out of the socket. The screen went black, instantly deleting an hour of my unsaved work. I stood up, angry, prepared to yell at him, but when I looked at his face, the anger evaporated. His expression was completely blank, but there was a heavy, dangerous tension in his posture. He looked at me with a cold, predatory focus that made my skin crawl. "The work is done," he said slowly. "You leave now." I packed my bag in silence and walked to the elevator. He stood in the hallway and watched me until the doors closed. That incident planted a deep seed of suspicion in my mind. The unnatural comforting of the families, the rigid isolation at night, the strange behavior of the senior examiner, it all pointed to something deeply wrong in the basement of the hospital. I could not let it go. My scientific training demanded an explanation. I needed to know what the old man was doing when the doors were locked. The opportunity to find out came 3 days ago. We received the body of a young woman in the early afternoon. It was a tragic, sudden medical failure. Her family arrived shortly after. There was a large group of them, parents, siblings, and a fiancé. The viewing room was filled with absolute agony. The wailing was so loud it penetrated the thick walls of the examination suites. I watched from the end of the hallway. The janitor, moving with his slow, dragging shuffle, pushed open the door to the viewing room and went inside. Less than a minute later, absolute silence fell over the room. The janitor walked out, picking up his mop. 5 minutes later, the large family emerged. They were holding each other, talking softly, wiping away a few lingering tears. But the heavy, crushing despair was entirely gone. They looked relieved. They looked like a heavy physical weight had been lifted from their shoulders. I made my decision right then. I was going to find out what he was whispering, and I was going to find out why he had to be alone with the bodies at night. At 5:30, I packed my bag just like always. I said goodnight to the senior examiner and walked out to the main hallway toward the elevators. I slipped through the heavy fire door leading to the old supply storage room. The storage room is filled with dusty boxes of outdated medical supplies, broken rolling chairs, and old filing cabinets. It has not been used in years. I squeezed behind a tall metal shelving unit, sat down on the cold floor, and waited. I checked my watch. 6 o'clock passed. I heard the distant sound of the heavy main doors locking for the night. The hum of the daytime activity died down entirely, leaving the basement level in profound silence. The cold began to seep through my scrubs, making my joints ache. I listened closely for the sound of the mop bucket or the heavy dragging footsteps of the janitor. I heard nothing. Then, a new sound broke the silence. It was a heavy mechanical clinking, followed by the squeal of metal hinges. It was coming from the cold storage room, the room where we keep the large stainless steel refrigeration units that house the bodies before and after examination. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff. I pushed the fire door open just a crack and peered out into the hallway. The main overhead fluorescent lights had been turned off. The only illumination came from the faint green emergency exit signs mounted above the doors. I slipped out the storage room and walked silently down the tiled corridor. My heart was beating rapidly against my ribs. I felt the deep, instinctual warning telling me to turn around and find a way out of the building, but the need to know, the terrible curiosity pushed me forward. I reached the door to the cold storage room. It was slightly ajar. I pressed my back against the wall next to the door frame and listened. I heard a wet, heavy tearing sound. It sounded like thick fabric being ripped apart by bare hands, mixed with a sickening squelching noise. It was followed by a wet smacking sound. Someone was eating. I slowly leaned my head forward and looked through the gap in the door. The cold storage room was illuminated only by a small internal light of one of the open refrigeration drawers. The drawer had been pulled all the way out. Lying on the metal tray was the body of the young woman who had been brought in that afternoon. Standing over the metal tray was the janitor. His pale, wrinkled back was facing me. He was leaning heavily over the body. Both of his arms were buried deep inside the abdominal cavity of the corpse. My medical training tried to process what I was seeing. He was not using a scalpel, or even a bone saw, or surgical retractors. The woman's chest has not been opened through a standard Y incision. The old man had simply forced his bare hands directly through the skin, muscle, and ribs. I watched in absolute, paralyzing horror as his shoulders heaved backward. He pulled his hands out of the chest cavity with a wet, sucking pop. Held tightly in his long, blood-soaked fingers was a dark, heavy mass of tissue. It was her liver. The janitor raised the large, dark organ to his face. He opened his mouth. In the dim light, I saw that his jaw seemed to unhinge, dropping lower than humanly possible. His teeth were sharp, jagged, and completely black. He bit deeply into the raw tissue. The sound of his chewing was wet and loud in the quiet, echoing room. He swallowed a large piece whole, his throat bulging unnaturally, and then took another massive bite. I felt a violent wave of nausea hit my stomach. I clamped my hand tightly over my mouth to stop myself from gagging. My brain was screaming in panic. I stepped backward, pulling away from the door frame, desperate to run down the hallway and find a way out of the basement. I was completely terrified. As I moved my foot backward, my heel caught the edge of a heavy plastic biohazard bin sitting against the wall. The bin tipped over. It hit the tiled floor with a loud, hollow crash, spilling plastic gloves and empty syringes across the corridor. The sound was deafening in the silence. The wet chewing in the cold room stopped instantly. I froze. I did not breathe. I stared at the open gap in the doorway. A heavy, low growl vibrated from the cold room. It did not sound human. It sounded like the noise a large predator makes deep in its chest when it's disturbed at a kill. "Who is there?" the deep scraping voice asked. I did not answer. I turned and ran. I abandoned all caution. I sprinted down the dark hallway, my shoes slipping slightly on the polished tiles. I ran past the reception desk, heading blindly toward the back stairwell that led up to the emergency exit. Behind me, I heard the heavy metal door of the cold room smash violently open, slamming against the concrete wall. Then came the footsteps. They were heavy, incredibly fast, and accompanied by the sound of long fingernails clicking rapidly against the floor tiles. He was moving with terrifying speed. I reached the end of the main corridor and turned sharply into the autopsy suite. I thought I could cut through the examination rooms and reach the service elevator in the back. I pushed through the swinging double doors, plunging into the dark stainless steel room. I scrambled behind a large examination table, crouching low to the ground. I held my breath, pressing my back against the cold metal cabinet. The swinging doors burst open behind me. The janitor stepped into the autopsy suite. The dim ambient light from the hallway caught his figure. He was covered in dark blood from his chest to his chin. He was breathing heavily, the air whistling through his jagged teeth. I watched him from under the table. His posture was completely different. He stood tall, his limbs appearing too long for his body. His fingers dragged against the sides of the tables as he walked down the aisle. "You did not leave," he whispered. His voice echoed off the tile walls. "You broke the rule. I told you the work was done." I pressed my hands against my mouth, tears of pure terror stinging my eyes. I was trapped. The only exit to the room was behind him. He walked slowly past the table I was hiding behind. He did not look down. He continued toward the back of the room. I thought I had a chance if he moved far enough away. I could slip out from under the table and sprint for the swinging doors. I waited until his back was fully turned to me, the sound of his footsteps moving away. I shifted my weight on my knees, preparing to crawl. Suddenly, a massive blood-soaked hand dropped down from above the table and clamped violently onto my shoulder. I screamed. He ripped me upward, lifting my entire body weight effortlessly with one hand. He threw me across the room. I hit a metal rolling cart, sending stainless steel tools crashing to the floor, and collapsed onto my back. The breath was knocked out of me completely. I looked up, gasping for air. The janitor was standing over me. His face was a mask of cold. Predatory anger. His dark eyes were solid black, lacking any white. Blood dripped steadily from his chins onto my medical scrubs. I scrambled backward on the floor, kicking my legs away from him. My back hitting the solid concrete wall, I had nowhere left to run. "Please," I choked out, raising my hands defensively. "Please don't kill me. I won't say anything, I swear." He looked down at me, his jagged black teeth exposed. The heavy, rotting smell of raw meat and old blood washed over me, making my stomach heave. He crouched down, bringing his face inches away from mine. "Do you know what I am, doctor?" he asked. His voice was no longer a growl, but a calm, raspy whisper. I shook my head frantically, completely paralyzed by fear. I am a ghoul, he stated simply. I consume the flesh of the dead. It is my nature. It is how I sustain myself. I stared at him, my mind unable to fully accept the impossible reality of the creature crouching in front of me. I have lived in the dark spaces of humanity for a very long time, he continued, his black eyes unblinking. For centuries my kind dug in the dirt, breaking open wooden boxes, hunting in the mud and the rot. It was difficult, dangerous, and humans have always hunted us when they catch us. He reached out and grabbed the collar of my shirt, pulling me slightly closer. But the world changed, he said. Humans became organized. You built places like this, massive cold rooms where you gather your dead and lay them on silver platters. You made it easy. Why? I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Why don't you just kill me? Because of the arrangement, he said. I do not kill the living. Killing draws attention. It brings police, lights, and finally hunters. I only take from the dead, specifically the liver. It is the richest organ, holding the deepest essence of the body. I take the liver, and no one notices. Your senior examiner signs the paperwork, attributes the missing tissue to decay or trauma, and the bodies go to the fire or the earth. The pieces began to click together in my terrified mind. The senior examiner knew. She knew exactly what was happening in the basement at night. That was why she was so strict about the 6 o'clock rule. She was protecting him, or protecting the hospital from him. But what about the families? I asked, desperation pushing the words out of my mouth. What do you say to them in the viewing room? How do you stop them from crying? The ghoul smiled. It was a horrific, skin-stretching grimace. That is the price of the arrangement, he whispered. A transaction. Grief is a heavy, toxic energy. It poisons the living. When I consume the essence of their dead, I create a void. I whisper the ancient words of transaction, and I pull their grief into that void. I take their pain, I swallow their agony, and I leave them with peace. He leaned back slightly, tilting his head. I eat their dead, he said softly, and in exchange, they do not have to suffer the weight of the loss. It is a fair trade. I get my meal, and your hospital gets a reputation for peaceful grieving processes. The administration ignores me. The senior doctor turns a blind eye, and I eat in peace. And now you broke the rule, he said, his voice hardening again. His grip tightened on my collar. You are a loose thread. No, I pleaded, tears streaming down my face. I am not a loose thread. I understand now. I understand the transaction. You need me to process the bodies. You need me to sign the paperwork during the day so you can eat at night. I will help you, just like the senior doctor. He stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. The dark, black eyes searched my face, looking for deception. I held his gaze, terrified, projecting every ounce of sincerity I could muster into my expression. I was begging for my life. A new arrangement, he muttered softly. He leaned in close, his cold, wet lips pressing against my ear. If you ever speak of this to the living world, he whispered, his voice vibrating directly into my skull, I will not wait for you to end up on a metal tray. I will come to your home. I will tear you open while your heart is still beating, and I will eat you whole. Do you understand? Yes, I gasped, nodding frantically. I understand, I promise. He released my shirt. He stood up slowly, the impossible height returning to his posture. He looked down at me one last time, a look of complete predatory dominance. Go home, doctor, he said, turning around. The work is done. He walked back out the swinging doors, his heavy footsteps fading down the hallway toward the cold room to finish his meal. I lay on the floor of the autopsy suite for a long time. My entire body was shaking uncontrollably. When I finally found the strength to stand, I stumbled out of the room, ran up to the back stairwell, and burst out into the cold night air of the parking lot. I have not been back to the hospital since. I called in sick for the last 3 days, but I know I have to go back tomorrow. I know that if I quit, if I run away, he will think I'm going to break the arrangement. He will think I am a loose thread. I am writing this here because I need someone in the world to know the truth. I need this terrible secret to exist somewhere outside of my own head, because the weight of it is crushing me. I am a doctor. I took an oath to protect the living. And to do that, to survive, I have to feed the dead to a monster. Tomorrow morning, I will put on my scrubs. I will walk into the morgue, and I will nod to the old janitor with the mop. I will do whatever is necessary to survive, so I will never, ever stay past 6 o'clock ever again. That story was pretty spooky dooky. If that was to happen to me, I think I would be shitting bricks the whole time. But also at the same time, I think it would actually be pretty cool. I don't know, something about living in a world with like creatures sounds pretty cool to me. This next story is from r/horror stories by the user Donovan221. My wife admitted something on her deathbed. Now I'm glad she died. I'm in fear. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Everything just feels so surreal right now. My wife and I have been together for the last 35 years. We married young and had our daughter around 10 years later. I still remember the day she had to be taken to the hospital. I was at work when her water broke, but instead of calling and demanding I get there as soon as possible, she told me that it was the best I wait and that she was doing completely fine. I told her she was crazy if she thought I wasn't going to be there for the birth of my child. But she started screaming at me to stay where I was. I just chalked it up to birth hormones. I finished out the day, and as soon as I clocked out, I was flying to the hospital. It was a venture that proved fruitless, as when I arrived, my wife was nowhere to be found, and in the chaos of the busy hospital, my panic grew more and more until my pager started beeping. It was my wife's number, and in a confused hurry, I found the nearest phone to take her call. She was already home, asking me where I had been. After a little back and forth about the sheer audacity of that statement, I got in my car and drove home as quickly as I could. When I got there, I found her curled up in her chair in the living room, cradling our baby and looking both exhausted and completely drained. Under normal circumstances, this should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. But really, all I felt was confusion. Why? Because we were scheduled to have a baby boy for her entire pregnancy. That's what the doctors kept telling us. Her explanation was that there had been some mistake with the paperwork. Pretty expensive mistake, I guess. Because we had spent hundreds on clothes and toys for her boy. I still allowed myself to feel happy. I mean, I was a new father. I had waited 9 months for this moment. I wasn't going to let some paperwork issue rain on my parade. Besides, her mom seemed in no mood to argue. I spent the entire first night back home curled up in bed with my wife and our baby girl. I soothed them to sleep in each other's arms. I rubbed my wife's back. I held the baby when she cried. It was the start of our new life. From that moment on, I worked my ass off to give them a decent life. Kept food on the table, keep the lights on in the house. I'd even save up every month for big gifts like jewelry and swing sets. Watching my daughter grow up was one of the most magical experiences of my life. Watching her go from her first steps to her first day of school, seeing her grow into a blossoming young woman, and eventually walking across the stage for her high school graduation. Nobody ever said we looked alike. Nobody ever said she and her mom even looked alike. And if I'm being honest, I thought the same thing, but it didn't change how I loved her. But unfortunately, every fairy tale must come to an end, and ours ended with her mom being diagnosed with cancer. Those were some of the most difficult years of my life. Watching the woman I love lose her appetite, lose her hair, lose her life, it broke something within me. I was by her side every day, right there with my daughter. However, on the day we lost her, my daughter had been in class at the state university 100 miles away, and I was all alone, watching the world crumble before my very eyes. In those last moments, she looked at me with the same love she had back when we first met, only this time it was more reminiscent, more sad, like she was realizing that everything was coming to an end. And that's when her face changed. Her smile faded, her forehead creased. She started sobbing. The words she spoke to me next are what have sent me over the edge. I've been questioning our relationship, our life, and everything in between ever since. I want to say I was lost, but truthfully, it made everything make sense. Because according to my wife, our son died at birth after some complications. I guess something snapped in her mind when she was told that day her baby didn't make it. Instead of accepting, she rejected. My daughter was stolen, and I still haven't found the heart to tell her. That story had such a crazy plot twist, But what's even more crazier that's probably happened, and probably a couple of times actually. I don't even know how I would break that to my daughter, and I don't even know what I would do if I was told that by my parents. That's gonna be the last story for this video. If you made it this far, comment down below which story you liked the best, and if you enjoyed the video, drop a like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.